This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is Nelson Villoria, K-State professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics, with two segments discussing tariffs. He explains how tariffs work, who pays for the tariff, retaliatory tariffs, and how historically tariffs have impacted agriculture and consumers. Nelson continues to build on his conversation about tariffs in the second segment. K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd ends the show with an update on early spring insect pests, including clover mites and ants. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show talking about tariffs and breaking them down and finding out some more information about them from Professor in K-State's Department of Agricultural Economics, Nelson Villoria. Nelson, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Nelson, as we have this conversation about tariffs, starting at the baseline, what is a tariff?
So a tariff is fundamentally a tax imposed by the government on imported goods and or services.
So, Nelson, how does a tariff work?
So, when you apply a tariff to all the goods that are imported entering the U.S., the prices will go up. And when prices go up, demand goes down, right? When you have few goods in the market, the prices go up. And that's what raises prices domestically. So you have the imports coming in, you put a tax on them, you make more expensive, you raise the domestic price, and all the prices domestically are going to increase. So as this happens, consumers are going to consume less of that good, and for whatever they are consuming, they're going to pay more. The government takes some of that, and we'll talk about that as government revenue, as tariff revenue, and the rest. And what happens is that you have a transfer from consumers to producers, and that's why tariff increase production. Basically, you are increasing the price, you are making domestic production more competitive, and it's a transfer. So what we need to keep in mind about this transfer is that it's not free. So if you are putting a tariff of 10%, prices go up by 10%, consumers are going to pay more for that tariff. Part goes to the government, part goes to producer, but an important part of that money just vanishes in the economy. Why? Because you are consuming less than you would consume otherwise. You are basically having to spend more money than you would otherwise on those same goods, and you are probably cutting your expenditures somewhere else. On the production side, we have inefficiency losses. So we are very good at producing soybeans, let's say. If we distract those resources to produce something that we are not as good, that we need protection, so that's a loss in efficiency, and those losses are not recovered by the economy. So those are the basic economics of a tariff.
Who pays that tariff then? So
technically, the importer pays the tariff to the customs authority. This is why tariffs are a source of government revenue. And if we look at the numbers today, tariffs are around 2% of total government revenue. So if you think about all the money that the government gets, 50% of that it's income taxes. Another 35, almost 40%, it's Social Security and Medicare taxes. What comes out of our paycheck? You have corporate taxes, tariff, that's at 2%, give or take, of that revenue. So that's what goes to the government. This doesn't mean, of course, that the importer is absorbing the tariff and reducing the profits. What happens is that the importer passes that increase onto consumers or to the overseas producers. That's sort of and that's what we call the incidence of the tariff. And the question here, which of these groups will bear the brunt of the tariff? the foreign producers that we are taxing or the domestic consumers that are within the country where the tariff is applied? And the answer depends fundamentally on the market share that we have of a product. If we don't buy if we buy a pretty small share of a good and we put a tariff on that, it's very unlikely that foreign producers decide to lower their prices or reduce their profits. They probably are going to basically push the prices onto consumers. Okay, that's what we call the pass-through, the tariff pass-through. Now, if we are a pretty dominant country, we import 90% of a given product, it's very likely that when we tax that product, foreign producers decide to lower their prices. And in that sense, we are pushing the cost of the tariff towards those foreign producers. Still, you generally will have increases in domestic prices and consumers will still have a higher cost. But now you are sharing the cost with foreign producers. So say if a tariff of 10% and you have quite a bit of market power, prices may go up here within the U.S. by 3% and foreign producers reduce their profits by 7%, and you get the revenues from the government, and so forth. So that's basically how tariffs are paid for.
Why are tariffs used then sometimes by different countries?
Yeah, so historically, they were a significant source of government revenue, particularly before we had domestic income and consumption taxes. So if we look at the data, 1920, 1910, you could say that import tariffs were 50-60% of government revenue. They are 2% now. We didn't have income taxes back then. And this is something that has happened globally. Some countries tax income, other countries tax consumption. So you pay a sales tax and a value-added tax, and that's what the government is receiving. So that's sort of the historical precedent for that. For some nations, nowadays, they remain relevant, and taxes go both ways. So you can tax consumption, you tax imports, and so tariffs are a source of government revenue. But if you are a country that produces a lot of corn, say Argentina, they tax their exports. So farmers pay a tax to the government before exporting, and that's a way that the government creates revenue. So it's an income tax, but based on the product, okay? Nowadays, however, tariffs are pretty much for protection, and again, the idea is to shield domestic industries for foreign competition. You are basically, I'm not going to import that much, I'm going to import less, that will increase my prices, and basically when you put tariff, you make domestically produced alternative more attractive. And this is the argument of, tariff create jobs. Well, basically, or tariff will bring manufacturers back. Well, because now it's more expensive to buy them abroad than here, so that would be the logic there. So, local employment. Many countries have used tariff to, foster infant industries. If you think about countries in South America, or just to put an example, but this happened as well in Asia, all over the place, and in the U.S. in some point, you want to have an aircraft industry. That's a highly competitive industry. It's super expensive just to get it started and to develop the technology. So some countries have decided to highly protect that industry. It's an infant industry, under the theory that in some point it'll grow up and you won't have to protect it anymore. Sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't work. Or to facilitate what economists would call import substitution industrialization. So these were policies that were pretty popular in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and we are seeing them again in many places. Tariff can also be used strategically to correct real or perceived trade imbalances. We have what we call anti-dumping, when you suspect that a country is producing below production cost. It's selling in international markets below production cost. It's dumping stuff in the market. You can have anti-dumping tariff. You could also counteract foreign export subsidies. If I have the suspicion that my competitor is subsidizing under the cover of dark a product, and that's making it more competitive, I could put a tariff on that. Or also to respond to currency manipulation. If I have evidence that a country it's lowering their exchange rate to make their exports more competitive, I could put a tax. So those are some of the reasons they are used. And they also can serve as a broader political leverage for over other trading partners. Particularly when we're talking about industries that are considered national security, for example, to have some leverage on the way that on protection.
And Nelson, as we're talking about tariffs, there's also some historical data that's valuable for our listeners to hear about.
So, yeah, absolutely. And it's sort of an interesting history, right? If you go back in time, and we are talking about circa 1947, after the Second World War and when the war, Europe is rebuilding itself and whatnot. The U.S. and Europe and some countries in Asia, but was pretty much the U.S. and some of the countries that nowadays are the European Union, had this general agreement on trade and tariff. That's sort of the grandfather of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So back then, you had excessively high levels of protection. And when they start, and we're talking about the average across products, so it's an average. It was, talking about high levels of protection, was around 22%.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll once again be joined by Nelson Villoria to discuss tariffs. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show and conversation about tariffs with Professor in K-State's Department of Agricultural Economics, Nelson Villoria. Nelson, we ended the last segment talking about some history with tariffs, and can you pick up on that as we discussed the 1990s?
By the mid-90s, countries had liberalized trade. Again, on average, there are very protected sectors. There are sectors that are free trade, but it was around 5%. And we are talking here about high-income countries, developed countries. And this is pretty much, back then it was some countries in Europe, the U.S. and Japan. So in developing countries, the situation, initial tariffs were higher, and by the mid-90s, they were about around 9%. So that's how things were, 30 years ago. Things have evolved. If you look at data around 2017, the global average applied tariff was 2.5%. And for 2/3 of international trade, it occurred without any tariff at all. So that's globalization, that's free trade. That's what happened over that period. Now, the big exception here all the time has been agriculture. Okay, so if we look at the tariff for agriculture, nowadays it's around 10%. And what happens to agriculture is that it's very sensitive for a number of reasons. Food security, keeping your country populated and thriving, the rural part of the country, and in other places, they are exporters of agricultural stuff, so their exchange rates and all that depend on agricultural tariff. So agriculture was always excluded from these negotiations, and this it's been always a tricky point in international negotiations about free trade. That's the reason we have quotas. Quotas were the best attempt to liberalize some trade across countries. So the U.S. would say, I cannot open up my sugar markets or other markets where we have quotas. Or Canada, for example, have quotas on dairy, or there are 40 countries in the world use these quotas. And that assures that you can sell something into those countries without necessarily jeopardizing their food security or their internal objective, whatever those are. The thing with quotas, and they are relevant because they are sort of the points of contention nowadays, is that you can allow for much less access that you promise just by the way that you administer the quotas. So if you take the case of China, for example, and quotas for corn and wheat and soybeans, they manage those quotas in a way that they are highly protective. So it's not a tariff. It's not 10%. Well, I know that I have to pay 10%, so be it. Here you are supposed to be able to export a number of bushels, and then you cannot get into that market. Okay? So the fact that agricultural protection is high in terms of when we speak about tariff, it's because of the quotas. If you look at U.S. prices of sugar, they are twice the world prices. So it's a tariff of 100% effectively. So that's part of they are pretty closely related, so quotas and tariff, to the history, the evolution, and the size of the tariff that we see today, and the market access issues that we have with agriculture today that underpin some of the disagreements among countries.
And when we think about tariffs, thinking about sometimes the effect of tariffs, retaliatory tariffs, and what impact can that be?
What happens with tariff is that when you impose them in another country, those countries are going to retaliate, trying to. It's a trade war. That's a technical term, trade war. So recall that we discussed at the beginning the idea that if you have a lot of a market share on a product, you would like to apply tariff to that product because you can push a lot of those costs onto the foreign producers. And that's the same with retaliatory tariff. The retaliatory tariff that we saw in 2018 applied by China to the U.S. were in things like soybeans, or corn, or other agricultural products where they have very large market shares. And then by doing so, they are also paying more. So just as our consumers are being harmed by that tariff, and let me make sort of a point here. It's not only a consumer. It's not only a final consumer. It's also the user, right? So if you are producing feed, you are going to import corn that is an input into your production process. Well, you're also paying that tariff, right? So it's the user, either consumer or intermediate use. So that's the issue with retaliatory tariffs, that they are applied in a way that you can actually inflict pain on the country that you're fighting with. And that's why we see the type of retaliatory tariff that we see. They are on pretty particular spirits that belong to one part of the country, or agriculture, soybeans with corn, etc. So those are the ones that, for agriculture in the U.S., matter quite a bit.
Nelson, we've talked today a lot about how tariffs work and just learning more about them, but can you share with us some numbers that we've seen from past tariffs?
Absolutely. And so I think going through all the conversation that we have had so far, there has been quite a bit of serious and credible research on the effects of the tariff that we had in 2018, 2019 for reasons of national security and for correcting some imbalances in competitions in industries like steel and whatnot. And something that we saw of those tariffs at that time and was surprising is that the tariff pass-through, so how much of the tariff we ended up paying as a consumer, was close to 95%. And it's been puzzling because, well, you would have, the hypothesis was, we are a large country, so we probably can share that cost with foreign producers. Now, there are, prices don't change as quickly as the economists say that prices are sticky. That's one possibility of what happened there. The other is that you don't know for how long the tariffs are going to be there. So if it's a temporary shock, a temporary change, you may just pass all the cost onto the consumers in the taxing country. So that's sort of the evidence there. And that was sort of short run, like we're talking about 2018, 2019. In the longer term, what the research has indicated, the pass-through was still very high, around 90%, so it's still puzzling. There is a bit of a complication here, that exchange rates move in a way that help those pass-throughs to remain high as well. So the macroeconomy plays a very important role here, and it's a bit, more difficult to predict how it will react. But the other thing that we saw in 2018, 2019, and that coincides with COVID-19, so upheaval in the world economy, okay? And it's what we economists call the great reallocation. And what is a great reallocation? It's the fact that supply chains around the world are reconfiguring in a way that we are still understanding. But basically, a country like Vietnam, for example, so increase exports to the U.S. by 35% in 2019. So you are importing less than from China. You still have the need for consumption. You have higher prices. Now another country can come and compete, a country that may not have been able to compete before in the U.S. Well, prices are higher. I can go there. So all of a sudden you have a new player in that sort of game. There have been a concern about, well, how much? And the two countries that figure like prominently here are Vietnam and Mexico. So exports of those countries, producers there saw opportunities when they were not competing with China. There has been the question, well, is this rerouting? Is this China sort of rerouting their production, their widgets and machineries and textiles and whatnot through Vietnam and Mexico? To some extent. But out of that 35%, only 20% it's rerouting. So the other is actually new trade, producers seeing new opportunities. And that's something that we have learned from this dynamic that has been interesting. So in terms of, who pays for the tariff? Consumers absorb a lot of the burden of the tariff. You have these long-term changes in supply chains. We have decoupled to some extent from China in this complex, and we are talking about very complex, sophisticated, iPhones and whatnot, supply chains. For agriculture, well, we have the retaliatory tariffs that were applied on that period. And a lot of that, well, there were this market facilitation program, the payments, direct payments from the market facilitation program that sort of were aimed to cover the losses from. What we see, there is that market shares change over time. So if the changes in tariff are permanent, it's really a change in prices. And if the changes in prices are permanent, you change the way that countries compete in international markets, and other countries may compete for those markets.
That was Professor in K-State's Department of Agricultural Economics, Nelson Villoria. If you'd like to hear the full conversation we had on tariffs, you can check out this special episode posted on agtoday.net or your favorite podcast streaming platform. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. In our first look at insect pests to be aware of in Kansas this spring, K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd discusses clover mites, lilac ash borer, and ants. Raymond, a chance to cover several topics today. Let's start off with clover mites. What are we seeing in terms of clover mites?
Okay, Jeff, that's a good question. Clover mites are a mite. You can't see them with the naked eye. They feed on turf grass. But one of the problems is they come into homes, and people get excited about that. The good news is they don't bite you, and they don't transmit a disease. But they can get into homes and get into corners and create a problem. We do have an extension fact sheet that I did several years ago on that. But let me give you some basics of dealing with them. Number one is keep your turf grass about 2 feet away from your foundation of your home. The next thing is maybe put a mulch, like a rock mulch. That'll be an inhospitable environment from them to go back and forth from the house to the turf grass. And if you need to, you can spray an insecticide from the bottom of the house up to the windows, up about 5 feet. And with an insecticide, it acts as a repellent mostly to keep them out. You also need to basically do exclusion by blocking any entries, like sealing cracks and crevices. You can also put double-sided sticky tape on window sills to trap them. If they do come in, don't squish them. They leave red stain. You can vacuum and put them outside. Also, don't overwater or over-fertilize your lawn because they do feed on the turf grass. So those are just some means of dealing with them, but you can access the clover mite fact sheet. Just Google Kansas State University clover mite extension publication, and all the information that you need to deal with clover mites will be in that publication.
We're also seeing some activity amongst lilac and ash borer.
Yeah, lilac and ash borer is a caterpillar borer specific for lilac or ash trees, and they come out in April. The male and female will mate. Then the female lays her complement of eggs on the bark of a tree or shrub, and the larvae enter and start the typical wood-boring insect destruction at that point. So if you do have a history of lilac or ash borer, this is the time of year to spray, I would say from the base to about 6 feet up, with a contact insecticide. So when the larvae do emerge, they come in contact with it and are consequently killed. And it may require several applications depending on the weather conditions. Rain will wash it off. But obviously, once they're inside, it's very difficult to deal with them other than keep your lilac or ash trees healthy as possible through proper fertility, watering, irrigation, and also mulching.
And ants are something we're seeing as well?
Yeah, this is the time of year when we start seeing ant swarmers, also termite swarmers. And what those are the male and female are winged, and they go out and they start finding a new nest. The males, after mating with the females, will die, and then the females will find a place in the soil, typically. She'll lose her wings, and then she'll start the establishing a nest. And we're talking over 35,000 eggs being laid by a female. So if you do see a winged reproductives, don't panic. Don't call the pest management professional, but just be aware the ants are coming out are going to be looking for a nest to establish. And then if they do come in the home, you probably want to put like a bait. One of our favorite ones is the taro boric acid bait, because you want those workers to take that bait back to the colony, feed the soldiers and queen, and it starts a slow process of the gradual diminishing of that colony. But it's a long-term process. But the swarmers are out, so just be aware that the ants will be looking for places to build a nest, mostly in the soil, for most of our ants that we have in Kansas.
And as you mentioned, a lot of extension publications are available.
Yes, we just updated the ticks publication. Ticks of Kansas got updated. We have mosquitoes in Kansas. We have chiggers in Kansas. And we have others. I'm developing one now on insect and mite pests of greenhouse-grown tomatoes. So we've got plenty of information. You can contact the Department of Entomology at Kansas State or get on the website and access some of those publications.
That's K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd with information on clover mites, lilac ash borer, and ants. In addition to extension publications, you can also contact the local extension office with your questions about insect pests or damage that you're seeing in the home landscape. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.